In this video, we're going to add some floor elements to a building model here. So floor elements are just simply the horizontal planes in the building. They represent the actual floor slabs. And to create them, we go into a special mode called Sketch Mode. So let's go ahead and get started. On the Architecture tab, we're going to use the Floor button. Now, you really only need to click the top half of this button, but if you prefer to use the drop-down, just make sure you're choosing the Floor Architectural option. It's the same button as the one at the top there. That brings us into sketch mode. Now, what is sketch mode? Well, it's got some pretty noticeable characteristics. The first is that the drawing window grays out and becomes kind of halftone. Okay, so that's one clue that we're in sketch mode. The next is that the Modify tab of the ribbon is now tinted in this greenish color. And then perhaps the most noticeable feature of sketch mode is the presence of the cancel and finish buttons right here. And those buttons are used to get you in and out of sketch mode. So the only way that we can leave this mode is to either cancel it with the red X or to finish it with the green checkbox. And we'll see those in just a few moments. But before we do that, let's talk about the other default settings that are in place here. Notice that this boundary line tool is already active. We're going to leave that. Notice that here in the draw toolbox, there's lots of shapes, but the pick walls tool is already active. We're going to keep that. Now, when Pick Walls is active, here on the options bar, you will also have this checkbox for Extend into Wall Core. We're going to leave that checked. Okay, so it should already be checked, but we're going to make sure that it is and leave it that way. Finally, the default type that we're using here in this file is generic 12-inch if you're working in Imperial, or generic 300 if you're working in metric. So if any of those settings weren't in place, then go ahead and configure those now to match my screen. And then let's get started by selecting our first wall. So I get a little tooltip there that says pick walls to create lines. I'm going to pick this top wall here. And when I do, it's going to trace over it with this magenta colored line. Now, you'll see that there's this little flip control on that line. And if you zoom in a little bit more closely, you can kind of see what's going on here. Now, we're working in the L1 working plan in this file. So you can see down here. And I previously set this to medium level of detail. And with medium level of detail, you can see that the layers of the internal structure of the wall assembly are showing. And that magenta line is on the face of the inside of the core. Now, if you were to click the flip grip, it will move that magenta line out to the outside face of the core. But notice it doesn't go all the way out to the exterior of the wall. And that's because there's a small layer of drywall there that accounts for a little bit of additional thickness. So when you do extend into core, you're tracing either the inside or outside face of the core of the wall. Let's make sure it's the outermost face, and then I'm going to zoom back out and continue here. So just verify that all your settings are still in place, boundary line and pick walls, and then I'm going to continue around like so and stop right there. I'll do this short wall here and the horizontal here and there, and I'm skipping this one at the front. Notice that at the front, this is in two pieces here. Okay, so I'm not going to pick the long lateral one off to the right there. Now, in order for us to be able to click the finish checkbox, we must have a valid sketch. A valid sketch is an enclosed loop or an enclosed ring. If you tried to click finish, it will generate a warning down in the lower right-hand corner. Now, it will highlight the offending area in orange on screen. And of course, that's the area where we didn't draw a sketch line. And of course, you're seeing that the error is telling us that we must have a closed loop. Now, if you click quit sketching, it's going to cancel all the way out of the command. So don't do that. What we want to do is continue and just fix that problem. So there are two easy solutions. You can either touch this wall and add another sketch line. I don't personally like having two sketch lines touching endpoint to endpoint like that. So what I prefer to do instead is go to trim and extend to corner. And I'm going to take this small line here and trim it up to this one. And that will achieve the same result, but it will make this one continuous line across the front there. Honestly, you can do it either way, though. It really doesn't matter. And now you should be able to click the green finish checkbox to complete the sketch. Now, when you do, you'll get this message asking what you want to do with the overlapping walls. Now, we don't see those overlapping walls in this view. I'm going to show them to you a little bit later. But for now, what I'd like you to do is just say don't attach. And I'll come back and discuss that topic a little bit more later on. So in the meantime, you can see the floor shape has been created and it's still selected. And if you notice that there's something wrong with it and you want to make a correction, notice that there's an edit boundary button right here. You can click that and go right back into the sketch. You could select something that you want to change. You could modify it. And then as long as you still have a valid shape, you could click finish and complete that sketch and it would modify it based on your changes. If you change your mind and you want to go back to the original, that's when the cancel edit mode would come in. So if I click cancel, it will warn me, are you sure? I'm going to discard your edits. I'm going to say yes here. And it goes back to the original shape, which is what I wanted in this case. So that's the basic workflow for creating a floor. It's a pretty straightforward process. So let's repeat that process on the second floor. So I'm going to double click L2 working, and that opens up that floor plan. And now let's just go through the whole process again. So I'm going to go to the floor button. That puts me in sketch mode. I'm going to accept all the defaults again, and I'm going to pick the top edge, this one over here. I got the wrong one there, so let me do a Control Z to undo that and try again. This one over here, this one at the bottom, and this one right here. Now, in this case, I want a double volume space here next to the stairwell looking down over a balcony. So I don't want to continue around that opening. So what I'm going to do instead is go to my trim and extend to corner, pick the vertical line right here, and then it matters now which side you click on the horizontal line. Don't click this side because it will give you the wrong sketch. You want to click the side you want to keep. So I want to keep to the left, and that will enclose that shape there over on the left. Now, I'm going to click the Modify tool to finish and zoom in here at the stairs. This is a valid sketch, and I could click Finish Edit Mode. The trouble is, somebody coming up the stairs here wouldn't be able to get across to this landing. So we need to adjust the shape of this just a little bit more. So what I'm going to do for this is here in the toolbox, I'll scroll up and I'm going to just use the straight line tool. I'm going to trace right along the front edge of this stair, pull it laterally across in a horizontal direction here. And I'm going to go 1'6" if you're working in imperial or 450 millimeters if you're working in metric. And then I'm going to pull it down at a 45 degree and I'll just sort of stop right about there. I'm going to click the Modify tool to finish, go to trim and extend to corner, take this horizontal line at the top and extend it to this vertical one that I drew here, take this diagonal line and trim it down to this vertical one here. Again, remembering to pick the lower portion because that's the piece that you want to keep. So now that floor shape makes a little bit more sense and allows folks to get up the stairs properly. So let's click Finish. And this time we're going to get two questions. So we're getting that same question we saw earlier about the walls that go up to this floor. Now, last time we clicked Don't Attach. This time I want you to click Attach. And again, I'm going to show you what that did in just a moment. That zooms us out and takes us to this message. This one is a little bit more visually confirming here because it's highlighting all of the exterior walls and asking us if we want to do a join geometry operation on those situations. And I'm going to answer yes here. Now, to really understand what both of those questions did and to understand why we didn't answer yes the first time, let's cut a section through the model and take a look. So to create a section is easy. You just come up here on the quick access toolbar and click the section tool. So I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to start just outside of this window, click and drag to the right a little bit, and then click again. And that creates a section. To open this section, just click away from it, select it, right click and choose Go to View. And it's going to open that section view up. I'll zoom in on it. And now let's talk about what those questions actually did for us. So the first question said, would you like the walls that go up to this floor's level to attach to their bottom? Here's an example right here. This wall actually goes up to a top constraint of L2. L2 is there. So had we answered no to that question, it would look like this. I'm going to do detach top and base and click this wall. And you see how the wall would have gone right through the floor assembly. Instead, we answered yes. We said attach, and that's this button right here. And when we did, it attached to this floor. And so you could see it pulls that top of the wall down to the underside of the floor. Okay. So often that can be a nice relationship to establish. The second question said, would you like to join geometry? And that's what we're seeing here with the exterior wall and the floor. And when you select them, the shading kind of tells you what's going on there. Even though we did extend into core, when it pulls those two pieces of geometry together, the join is merging in that all and making a nice clean intersection. Had we said no, it would have looked more like this one, where these two, the wall and the floor, are just ignoring each other. Now, the reason that this one looks this way is these were the walls that were asking us in the first floor if we wanted to attach to the underside. Had I selected that and chose attach top and base, it would have looked like that. And you would have had this weird little notch here on the outside of the building. So this is why I chose not to attach. So I think here it makes more sense to use join geometry. So if I go to the modify tab and choose join geometry, pick the exterior wall and the floor, you're going to see it looks like this. Now, if you don't want the floor to dominate over the wall, it turns out that the join geometry tool has some options. So you can join, you can of course unjoin, which would reverse what we just did, and you can do switch join order and select this, and then it will look like that instead. So feel free to use whichever one matches your preference, and feel free to explore the other connections in this model by cutting additional sections if you wish. In this video, we're going to add some roofs to our building model. Now, the tool that we're going to use is the footprint roof tool, and adding roofs with the footprint roof is very similar to adding floors. So if you watched the previous video on adding floors, then a lot of this is going to be essentially review. Now, I'm in a floor plan called high roof, and the trouble that we're going to have initially is that all we're really seeing here is the columns. Okay, so this is simply because we're cutting above the building and we don't really have any wall geometry here visible at this height. So to remedy that and to make it easier for us to build our sketch, what we're going to do is temporarily turn on an underlay for this floor plan. So make sure that nothing is selected on screen. And the properties palette here should say floor plan. And if it does, scroll down and you're looking for the underlay setting. There's an option here for range for the base level. I'm going to set that from none to level 2. And then when I do, you're going to see the geometry of level 2 ghost in as an underlay. And what's nice about that is that's the live model geometry in the building. And we can use that now as a reference to create the roof element. So having done that, we can now come over here to the roof by footprint tool. Now it's similar to the floor tool. You really only need to click the top half of the button, but if you prefer the drop down, it's roof by footprint. So just make sure you're choosing that roof by footprint tool, and that takes us to sketch mode. Now, if you watch the video on floors, then this sketch mode is very similar. So we're going to accept all of the defaults here, boundary line and pick walls, but we are going to change a few things on the options bar. Okay, so we don't want to extend into core this time, so leave that unchecked, but we do want to introduce an overhang. So if you're working in the imperial file, put in 2 feet here. And if you're working in the metric file, put in 600 millimeters. Now I'm going to do the generic 9-inch for imperial, and that should be generic 250 if you're working in metric. So the difference now is that if you come over here and hover on one of the exterior walls, notice that the line that's going to be created is set at whatever distance you set your overhang to instead of going right on top of the wall. So I'm going to click on this wall right here, this one here, this one down at the bottom, and then this one right here running vertically. Now there are some gaps. So as we saw in the video on creating floors, if you tried to click finish right now, it would generate a warning because you don't have a valid enclosed sketch. What I'm going to do is go to trim and extend to corner, And I'm going to trim this one to close up that corner, and this one to this one to close up that corner. Now I'm going to click finish here. And before I do, I just want to point out the presence of these little triangles. Okay. So those are meaningful because that means that these are sloped edges. So let me show you what that looks like by clicking finish. You're going to see something occur here with the roof, and it's got these little chamfered corners, but it's not showing us the full roof object in this view because of something called view range. Now we're going to discuss view range in a future video. So for now, we're just going to ignore that. And instead, let's look at this in 3D. So I'm going to come up here to the default 3D view icon, click that, and you can see if you zoom in here, and maybe hold the shift key and orbit slightly, you can see what that created. So with those triangles, it was indicating that the edges of the roof were going to be sloped. And so what we ended up with was a hip roof. Okay. Now I don't think a hip roof is maybe the best choice for this building. So I'm going to select it, and then we can choose edit footprint to make modifications. So I'm going to modify that, and it turns out that you can click any of these sketch lines, and there's a few things you can do. You can edit the individual slopes of each sketch line, and you can also disable the slope of those sketch lines entirely. So what I'm going to do is select this sketch line out at the front here, this one right here at the back, and then I'm going to turn off defines slope. When I do, if I click finish, you're going to see that we now have a gable roof. Now that's a little better, but it's a touch too steep right now. So in addition to being able to change the slope individually, sketch line by sketch line in the sketch, when you're outside the sketch, you can come over here to the properties palette and change the slope of the entire roof. So that will change the slope on both sides. So you won't have to do them one at a time. So here in the Imperial file, I'm going to put in 3. Now this is rise over run in the Imperial file. So it's 3 inches of rise for every 12 inches of run. And when I apply that, you're going to see that roof get significantly shallower. If you're working in the metric file, put in 18.5. Now that's in degrees in the metric file. So it'll be 18.5 degrees, and it should have a similar slope. Now that looks a little bit better, but I still want to make one more modification here. So I'm going to click edit footprint, and I want to chop off this corner of the roof here so that it matches more of the shape of the building. So here in the toolbox, I'm going to go back to pick walls. It should still have my overhang setting. I'm going to leave that, but I'm going to turn off defines slope. So before you create the sketch lines, you can decide whether or not they're sloped. And then I'm going to touch this exterior wall here and this one here. And if you're fortunate, it should do all the trimming for you. But if for some reason it did not do the trimming automatically, you can always use trim and extend to corner to get a valid sketch. And when you're done, click finish. And now you can see our completed roof form there, and it matches the shape of the building. So we're going to create a couple more quick roofs here because that's just one type of roof, right? We started with a hip and we turned it to a gable, but there's plenty of other shapes of roofs that you can create. So let me go back to the roof plan here, and I'm going to focus on this wing of the building now. And in that location, I want to do a completely flat roof. Okay. So I'm going to go to architecture, roof by footprint. I'm still going to do pick walls. I don't want to extend into core. And this time I want to turn off the overhang. So I'm going to set that to 0. Now, define slope should already be off based on the sketches that we just did a moment ago. But if for some reason it's on, go ahead and uncheck that. And now you should be able to click and do the inside faces of these walls over here. And then this one right here. And that should make a nice closed rectangular shape. If for some reason it needs trimming, go ahead and use trim and extend. And then let's click finish. Now, if we go back to 3D, there's one small problem. It is much too tall. Okay. So what we're going to do is keep that roof selected. And then on the properties palette here, instead of basing it on the high roof level, we can drop it down to a different level, like low roof. And when I do, you're going to see that roof drop down to a more appropriate location. So That's the second roof that we want. And then finally, we're going to create a third roof out in front of the building that will provide like a canopy for a walkway at the front entrance. So back to the roof plan and back to architecture and footprint roof. I'll start with pick walls without defining any slope. And I'm going to pick this exterior wall here and this one here. Now, those are really the only two that we can use pick walls on. So now what I want to do is just draw a straight line, and I'm going to start right at this endpoint here at the edge of the building and just kind of pull that straight down, and I'm going to either type in or snap to the distance I want, which is 9 feet in imperial or 2,700 millimeters if you're working in metric. Now, this edge I want to define slope. So I'm going to pull it across and just sort of draw it like so, press escape 2 times to get all the way out. So I'm going to select this line, check the define slope box, and then for the slope in imperial, I want to do 2 in 12. And if you're working in metric, it's 9.5 degrees. Now I do need to clean up this sketch. So I'm going to do TR or click the tool right here and trim and extend each of these corners to create the rectangular form like so. And when we click finish, because it's only sloping along one edge there, when we go back to 3D, you'll see that it's a very subtle shed roof. But once again, it's too tall because it's set to the high roof. This one I'm going to move down to L2, and that brings it into a more appropriate location. So those are the 3 roof forms that we need for the basic form of our building. In this video, we're going to look at the attach top and base command in a little bit more detail than we have previously. So just to remind you of what this command does, we've got this gap here underneath the roof at the tops of the walls, and I'd like to fill that in. And so it's pretty easy to do. All you need to do is select the element that you want to attach, in this case, the wall, and I'll pick one of these exterior walls here. And then over here on the ribbon, you've got this attach top and base tool. Click that, and then it's going to prompt you either on screen or on the status bar to select the roofs, floors, ceilings, or topo solids that you want to attach this wall to. So I'm going to highlight the roof. Now, in order to make sure you're selecting the roof properly, make sure you're clicking near one of its edges. Okay, so I'm going to click right here along the ridge line, and you will see it attach that wall to the underside of the roof. Now I'm going to hold the shift key and drag the wheel to orbit around so you can get a much better look at that. Okay, so that's really all there is to this command. Okay, now let's look at a way to do that a little bit more efficiently, because I could certainly go around and do each wall one at a time, but there's going to be a faster way. So let me deselect it and undo. I'm going to start again here. And what I want to do instead is leverage chain selection. Now you may recall that chain selection is where you highlight one wall, press the tab key, and it will go down endpoint to endpoint and select other walls that are connected end to end with that current wall. The trouble is, here in 3D, if I do that and click to make the selection, I get a selection of 4 walls. But what it did was it went around the corner and did 2 exterior walls. Then it went down to the foundation and came back again. Now, I'm not really sure why it did that. It's a little strange to me, but there's going to be a really easy solution to prevent it from doing that. I'm simply going to hide the foundation walls temporarily. So go ahead and select one of your foundation walls. And if you wish, also select one of the footings, right click, choose select all instances visible in the view. With those items selected, come down here to the little sunglasses icon and choose hide element. So that will temporarily hide all of that geometry in this view. And now if I highlight the exterior wall and press tab, you can see that I get a very different result. Now I'm going to click, and that selects all the walls on the perimeter of the building. Now that's close to what I want, but you can see that it missed this wall here on the second floor, and it included these 3 on this little east wing over here. I don't want those 3 selected, and I do want the other one that it missed. So how can we deal with that? Well, I'm going to actually click an empty white space, and we're going to try again with the chain selection, and I want to show you a cool feature of chain selection, but it does take a little practice. Okay, highlight the exterior wall. Press tab. Don't click yet. We're getting the same chain. Move your mouse very slightly to the inside face of the wall, and it should highlight the inner chain instead. So you can see it there highlighted. I'm going to go back to the outside face. There's the outer chain. Here's the, I lost it. There's the inner chain right there. Okay. So it is a little tricky. It does take some practice, but don't give up on it because this is a really powerful way to select elements. So I think it's worth your effort to practice it until you get comfortable with it. That's the chain I want. I'm going to click, and now it selects all of the walls that we need. I don't need to make any additional modifications. So once I've got those walls selected, I always like to check the properties palette just to do a gut check on the quantity. So notice over there it says walls 7. So I don't know that that's exactly the correct quantity, but it seems plausible. 7 seems like the correct number to me. So I feel confident to go forward. So that's all I'm asking you to do is just do a gut check. Does that seem like a reasonable number? And it does. So now I'm going to go to attach top and base, highlight the edge of the roof, click, and if I shift and drag the wheel to orbit, you can see that it's now attached all of those walls to the underside of the roof instead of doing them one at a time. So that's obviously a much nicer way to do that. So I'm going to deselect those, and I want to show you that in a different view, this section at lobby. I'm going to double click to open that up, and let me just zoom in a little here at the top. And I'm going to take this section and use this little grip here and just kind of stretch it up a little taller so we can see the entire roof. Okay, so notice that the walls that are attached to that roof have not only followed the shape in plan, but they're also cutting along the angle here of the slope of the roof. Okay, so that's a really nice feature of this attach tool. Now, if I select this wall and look at its properties, here's just a little anomaly that I want to point out to you. It still says it's going up to the high roof. Okay, high roof is right here. Okay, this line right here. Suppose I were to take this roof and use the base offset from level parameter and increase that. Let me go 2 feet in imperial, 600 millimeters in metric. Notice what happens to those exterior walls. It went and stayed attached to the roof. And if you select it, it still says it's only going up to the high roof. So it's pretty important that you understand that. Like what you see on the properties palette may not exactly match what's really going on. Now, if I want to remove this, I could do detach, select the roof again, and the wall drops back down. And in that case, it would go back down to the high roof where it says it was. But it's not necessarily an issue, but it's just something for you to be aware of, okay? That when you use the attach functionality, it's kind of overriding what otherwise is listed for the top constraint and height there, okay? Now I'm going to undo once and twice to get that roof back where it was. Okay, the last thing I want to show you here is architectural columns and actually structural columns as well, but columns in general can also use this attach functionality. So what I'm going to do here is right here in this section, I'm going to make a little crossing selection across the top there because I only want the columns on the second floor. I'm going to go to filter, check none, and it's columns you want, not structural. We'll choose columns here, check the box, click OK, but notice that it only found 3. Now I'm going to open up the level 2 floor plan to show you why. Okay. We are standing here in that section looking up toward the plan. And so it only can select things you can actually see. And it missed all of these other columns here in the second floor plan. So what I'm going to do is hold down my control key, start maybe right about here, and make a window selection around the remainder of the second floor. Go back to filter, check none again, columns only, click OK. And now I have 10 columns. So that's a much more valid quantity. So you can see why checking that quantity is a good thing to get in the habit of doing. Because when I saw only 3, I said, that doesn't seem right. I know I have more columns on the second floor, and it forced me to go investigate. So this is what I was talking about when I said, do a gut check. And if it seems reasonable, continue. But if it doesn't, then investigate. So now that I have the correct selection, I'm going to complete the modification here in 3D. And to do this, I'm going to actually isolate this view even further. So I'm going to hold the control key down and add the roof here, and then come down to the sunglasses and choose isolate element. So I've got 11 elements selected, 10 columns, 1 roof, Now, those are the only things that are visible here in this 3D view. So I'm going to spin this slightly, zoom in. I'm going to hold the Shift key down and deselect the roof. The 10 columns are still selected. I'll do attach top and base, and I will pick the roof. And you're going to see them shoot up to the height of the roof, but notice that it's not terribly satisfying the way that it did it. So the top edges of those columns are just kind of flat there. Okay. Well, there's actually a setting that controls the way that they attach that you can do at the time of attachment, or you can fix them after the fact, which is what I'm going to do right now. So I'm going to scroll down here, and you're looking for the attachment justification at top. And there are 3 choices. Minimum is what we have. That's not so nice. Intersect at midline, I don't think is going to work either. Let's do maximum intersection, and that's going to be a lot nicer. Okay, so now I've attached those columns along the slope of the roof. That looks really good. I'll go to the sunglasses. I'll reset the temporary hide, and that completes all of the attachments that I wanted to make here in this model. So feel free to experiment further if you wish, and that is your attach top and base functionality. There are lots of different forms of roof that we can create in Revit, and the ones that we've built so far, we're just using the simple roof by footprint tool. But if you look at the drop-down menu on the roof tool, you can see that there are some other choices. So in this video, I'd like to do the roof by extrusion. Now, this is going to be a really simple sketch, which is going to define the profile shape of the roof, and then we're just going to give it a depth. Okay, and I'm actually going to do something very similar to what you see in that illustration right there. Now, I want to build this as a canopy out in front of this little exterior doorway right here. So I think the easiest way to draw that is going to be to work in an elevation that looks right at that wall. So I'm going to go to the east elevation here, east architectural, and I'm going to zoom in nice and close on this brick wall here. So now I'm going to go to the drop down, choose roof by extrusion, and that will prompt me to select a work plane. Now, a work plane is quite simply the plane on which you are drawing the sketch. Now, everything else that we've sketched so far, we've been working in a floor plan, so the work plane was obvious. But when you're working in an elevation, Revit needs you to kind of let it know what work plane you want to use for the sketch. There is a drop down here. We could sketch on any of the grid lines or reference planes. But in this case, I think pick a plane, which is already chosen, is the right option, because when I click OK, I can simply select the brick wall and use the surface of that brick wall as my work plane. So that's what I'm going to do, and click it. Now, even though we've set a work plane, the roof still needs to be associated to a level. All elements in Revit need to have a level association. So it almost doesn't matter what you choose here, but to me, it seems logical to choose the level that's closest to where I'm going to draw the roof, which is level 2 in this case. All right, and I will click OK. So that puts us in sketch mode. Okay, now I want to draw this as a curved form. So I'm going to choose the start and radius arc right here and use that as my sketch shape. And I want to start at about maybe 2.5 bricks away from the top corner of the door, and then about 5 bricks above that. And that's going to be the first point of my sketch. Then I'm going to move kind of diagonally up about 3 bricks and roughly at the middle of the doorway, and click again at the nearest brick intersection right there. And then you're drawing the amount of curvature. Now, you can make this as curved as you want. You don't have to do exactly what I'm doing, but I'm going to kind of make it so that it starts off flat and goes at a curve. And that grid intersection right there should probably give me what I'm looking for. Perhaps the one next to it, maybe that one there is a little bit nicer. And then I'm just simply going to click. Okay. Now I'm going to go horizontally this way to about 2.5 bricks to the right side of the door. Click again to make that an endpoint. And then finally, it should snap to a tangent of the existing curve if you just kind of move the mouse nearby there. And when I see that it says tangent, I will click to set the shape of the curve. So that's the shape that I'm looking for. I'm just going to click the modify tool to cancel out. And unlike a roof by footprint or a floor, you do not want an enclosed sketch here. The reason is the thickness of the roof is going to come from the type that you've designated. I've got generic 9-inch chosen, or if you're in metric, it'll be generic 250. So let's click finish, and you're going to see that thickness get applied, and there's our extruded roof. Now, the trouble with it is if you come over here to the 3D view, it's going to look a little odd because that extruded roof went inside the building instead of outside. Well, Revit assumes that we're trying to roof the building. So it took its best guess and said, well, here's the depth of the building. I'm just going to go back that far. It didn't know that we wanted to make a canopy in front of the door. So we can easily adjust the depths of this extrusion in a couple different ways. You can use these little grip controls and just sort of stretch it. So I can pull it away from the building there. And then I'm going to take the backside and pull that out in front of the building as well. And if I hold the shift key down in orbit, my canopy is now floating out away from the building. Let's zoom in a little bit closer there. Okay. But you can also adjust it here on the properties palette. So the smaller number is the extrusion end here. And what I want to actually do with that is zero it out. So when we do 0 and apply, you're going to see that roof is now flush to the brick wall. So it's attached right at that location. And then as far as the extrusion start, just set it to a rational size. So in this case, I'm going to say, let's make it 5 feet for the canopy in imperial, or if you're working in metric, that's going to be 1500 millimeters. And that should do it. That is our little free-form canopy created from an extrusion roof. Now, if you want to try your hand at some additional shapes, feel free to experiment further.
In this video, we're going to focus on this flat roof right here, and we're going to add some subtle slope to it for drainage because, of course, when you have a flat roof, it's never completely flat. There's always some degree of slope to it, which is usually determined by a building code. Now, the first thing you want to know about the technique I'm going to show you is that the tools that we need to access are only available if you start with a completely flat slab. So let me demonstrate that. If we select this sloped roof right here, you will notice that on the ribbon, we have a single button called Edit Footprint. However, if we select this flat roof right here, you will notice that next to Edit Footprint, we have a number of additional tools in the shape editing grouping. So those are the tools that we're going to be looking at here in this video. So the easiest way I can explain what the shape editing tools do for us is to just do a quick demonstration. So I'm going to use this Add Point tool right here. And I'm just going to click a couple random points on the surface of that roof. Then next to that, there's this Modify Sub-Element tool. I'll click that next, and I'm going to click the first point that I placed, and then you'll notice a temporary dimension appears next to it, and I will click that. And what I want to do is just simply add a little bit to this number. So whatever the number is, just add a little bit. I'm just going to add a foot here in imperial. You can add maybe 300 millimeters in metric. And you'll see an adjustment and maybe an error. We're just going to ignore that. And then I'm going to click this one and do the same thing, but this time I'm just going to subtract a small value. And again, the values are not important. I just want to illustrate how the tool works. And what you'll see is we get this triangulation along the surface of the roof. And it's probably best to understand in a different view, like a section view. I'm going to deselect the roof there, come over here to this section at East Wing, double click and open that up, and then zoom in, and you can now see what the result of those modifications were. So my roof is kind of bent and kinked and shaped in these sort of weird ways there. All right, so that's essentially what is possible with the shape editing tools. Now, I did that all randomly, and I want to be maybe a little bit more systematic about it now. So let's take this roof, and we're going to click the Reset Shape here, and it will kind of reset us back to a nice flat slab. And now we're going to do something a little more practical. So with that roof still selected, I'm going to come over here to the type selector, and in the imperial file, it's currently a generic 9-inch roof. In the metric, it's generic 225. Let's change it to insulation on metal deck EPDM in both files. Now, here in my Imperial file, this view is set to medium level of detail. If yours is not set to medium detail, please do that now. If it's set to coarse, you won't see any of the structure inside the roof. But if it's set to medium or fine, then you will. And you'll notice that it now has multiple layers of construction, just like our wall assemblies do. So roofs and wall assemblies use the same basic concept of being able to have layers of materials all sandwiched together. So that's the first step that I wanted to do. Now, the next thing I want to do is start laying out my roof in a little bit more systematic way. And I think it'll be easier to do that in the roof plan. So I'm going to go to the low roof floor plan right here, zoom in on the east wing. And what you'll notice is that I've added some reference planes here, here, and here. And I've got another one here down the middle. And then I used some dimensions that are just set to equality to make sure that those reference planes were marking off equal spaces. So we're just going to use those reference planes as guidelines to help us sculpt the roof. Now there's one more dimension over here, which is 25 foot 4 inches in the Imperial file and 7,600 millimeters in the metric file. So that's our total distance that we want to slope. So we want to pitch the roof down along that distance. So what we need to do is calculate how far we want this slope to be. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's usually a building code that determines this. Most of the building codes that I'm familiar with have a minimum slope of 1/4 inch for every 12 inches of run. That would translate to about 6¼ millimeters for every 300 millimeters of run. And that's the value that I'm going to be using for my calculations. But if your jurisdiction calls for a different slope, then feel free to use different numbers. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about calculating slopes in an architectural setting, I found this nice article here that you can look at. It talks about 3 different ways of calculating slope for architectural purposes. So I thought it was a good read. It's a pretty quick read. So go ahead and check that out if you're interested. Back to our roof here, I need to first select it. So the way I'm going to do that is to tab in. So I'm going to highlight one of the walls, press tab. That's going to do chain. Tab again is a different chain. One more time, that should give me the roof. And then I can click to select it. Another way to select it would be to go to the section view, select it there, then switch back over to the low roof. It's up to you. Okay. So once I've got that roof selected, we're now going to direct our attention to the shape editing tools that we looked at earlier. The first thing I want to do is go to the Modify Sub-Elements tool, and that will put us in an edit mode. It will put a green dashed line all the way around the outline of the roof, and you'll notice that there's also these little green dots at the corners. Now you could select any of these components, the dashed lines, the green dots, and then you could manipulate them with the values. So what I'm going to do is select this horizontal line down at the bottom, and I want to edit this value. However, notice that that value for me is currently saying 13'3" and some change, right? I'd have to do the math in order to get the right value starting with that number. But it turns out that if you look up here at the ribbon on the Modify Sub-Elements panel, you've got an elevation base parameter. And what we can do is use this drop down and choose a different base point for the elevation calculation. So you can see there's 5 different choices there. Now, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I think the one that'll be most convenient for us is to use the top plane. Top plane will zero out the value because now everything's going to be measured from the top surface of the roof. So all we have to think about is how high do we want to raise above the lowest point on the roof? And I think that's much more convenient. So I'm going to click on this value and put in the value I want. Now, in my Imperial file, again, I'm 25 foot plus. I'm going to round it up to 26 feet so that the calculation's a little bit easier. And if I divide my 26 feet by a 1/4 inch rise, I get about 6.5 inches of rise that I need here. So that's what I'm going to put in is 6.5 inches. If you're working in the metric file, I did the same calculation and it came up with about 160 millimeters. I just rounded it up to the nearest 10. Okay, so try about 160 and you should get to the same place. So now the result of that is if I go to the section view again, you will see that we've got this really subtle slope now on the entire roof. It's kind of like a really subtle shed roof. Okay, so we could stop there, but what I want to do further is direct any drainage to 2 drain points. We're going to have, maybe we'll have scuppers on the side of the building. Okay, and those drain points are going to be here and here. So we could use that same add point tool that we did last time, but this time I'm going to use a different tool, add split line. I actually like this one a little bit better. Okay. Now I do want to make sure that I'm drawing along the surface, and I do want to make sure that the top plane is set, because again, it'll just be more convenient to work that way, but not in every scenario. In some cases, you might want to choose one of the other elevation base points. And I'm going to start right here at this midpoint on the left-hand side. And then I'm going to go diagonally over to that intersection. Now you say I'm having a little tough time finding the intersection. You can type the keyboard shortcut SI, and that should make it easier for you to snap right to the intersection of the reference plane and the green dashed line. Then I want to start again right at that same spot and go back to this intersection here. Start again right at that same spot and go back to this one. And again, I'll use SI to help me. And then finally from here to the midpoint. Then I need one more line from this location to the midpoint here, and then I will switch to the Modify Sub-Elements tool. So we've got these split lines now, and notice that these points here are already half the distance of what we set here because of this reference plane being right in the middle. So all we need to do is select the points that we want to raise up to create these cricket forms. And it's going to be this point at the corner, hold the control key, this one, and this one. Now, because I have multiple points selected, I won't see a dimension on screen, but I can edit the elevation right here. And all I want to do is move this back to the original height, which in the imperial file was 6.5 inches, and in the metric file was 160 millimeters. So just simply type that in. And then if you switch back to your section, you can see the result there. Now, if you look carefully, you can see that we've still got this blue line here. So the slope is continuing down to those drain points off in the distance, kind of through the thickness of the roof there. We could stop here. This would be a valid roof. Sometimes folks do taper the actual structure of the roof. But if instead you want a flat underside of the roof and you just simply want to build up the roof with tapered rigid insulation, then there's one additional step. Come over here to the Edit Type button for the roof type that we're using. Here in the Edit Type dialog, you can duplicate it, and then I'm going to add a description, tapered insulation, to the name. And then I'll go to the Edit button here, and this should look familiar. This is similar to the wall type dialog that we looked at in an earlier video. And all we need to do is take our tapered rigid insulation layer right here and set it to variable. When you do that and you OK again, you'll see that the bottom of the roof flattens out, and now all of the variation occurs just within the insulation layer. I'll click the Modify tool to deselect everything, switch back to 3D, and zoom in, and you can see the final result here. One last thing you can do to check things out is you can go to the section, zoom in a little bit, and on the Annotate tab here, there's a Spot Slope tool. And you can use this to just sort of check that your slope is in fact correct based on your calculation. So it's always a good idea to check that if you can. And that completes our flat roof with drainage sloping.
In this video, we're going to look at an alternative way to apply slope to elements like roofs and floors called slope arrows. So we've already looked at slope defining edges and shape editing tools, and both of those are perfectly effective ways to slope a roof. But in this video, we're going to see that there is an alternative called slope arrows, which has some unique properties. Now, let me first demonstrate what the differences are. So I'm going to select this roof over here and go to Edit Footprint, select one of its edges, and turn on Define Slope, which is a method we've already looked at in an earlier video. When I click Finish, I get this shed form here, and it's sloping in a single direction. But the important thing that I want you to notice about it is the slope runs perpendicular to the edge that we turned on Define Slope. In other words, if you visualize that edge as a hinge, like a door hinge, then it's sloping up and away from the building along that defined edge. Now, the slope must follow perpendicular to the existing edge. But what if your building design called for the slope to run in a different direction? Then what would you do? Well, if I go back to Edit Footprint, select this edge, turn off the define slope, the alternative I want to consider is using a slope arrow. So with the slope arrow, you have a sketch-based solution. And what you do is you just sort of click somewhere and then you draw this arrow in any direction you like. See how I can draw it in any angle. So I'm just going to kind of go off at this angle like so to create this slope arrow. Now, if I try to finish this, it is going to generate a warning because there's another rule that you want to be aware of when it comes to slope arrows. The tails, the start point of the slope arrow, must lie on the roof boundary. Okay, so that's a rule. So I'm going to cancel this, select this slope arrow, go to the move command. Here's the tail right here. It's that start point. And then I'll just move that somewhere on the roof boundary. So it doesn't matter where on the roof boundary it is, just somewhere on the boundary is fine. And now when I click finish, you're going to see that it will allow me to apply that slope arrow. And look at how interesting that slope is now. So we sort of did that one completely random, right? So why don't we do it maybe a little bit more carefully on this one over here? So I'm going to select that roof, go to edit footprint, go to slope arrow. And this time what I'm going to do is start at this endpoint here, and I'm going to go across to the opposite endpoint right there. When I click finish, you will see that it's now sloping along the diagonal of the building with a low point down here and a high point up here, and it kind of slopes in that direction. I'm just accepting the defaults, but if we go to edit footprint, you can select the slope arrow and you can change how much slope is applied to that arrow. You can do that in one of two ways. You can specify the height at tail, or you can use the slope. Slope is just rise over run or degrees. So just like we were doing when we did slope defining edges, right? So you could just put in the value that you want there. Or if you do height at tail, what this allows you to do is specify two heights: the height at the start point of the slope arrow, the tail, and the height at the other end of the arrow where the arrowhead is here. So let me just double that. Okay, so it was currently going to 10 feet here in the imperial file, or 3,000 millimeters in the metric file. Let me just go ahead and double that value and click finish. And now you can see that this slope is much steeper. Okay, you have complete control over how much slope is applied. You just do that to the slope arrow itself. Now I'm going to edit it one more time. And I'm going to take this slope arrow here and I'm just going to delete that, and I'm going to draw it over again. And I'm going to start right at this point, but I want to stop in the middle of the square this time. So I'm going to right click and go to the snap overrides and choose snap between two midpoints. Keyboard shortcut for that is S2. And I'm going to go from this corner to the opposite corner here. And notice that that finds the midpoint right in the middle of the square. So I've drawn that slope arrow now half as long as what I had previously. Now I'm going to draw a second one from this point and snap right to here. So you can actually create as many slope arrows as you like in this sketch to create a more complex form. So when I click finish, now what I end up with is a ridge across the middle, and it slopes down to two low points on those opposite corners. If you wanted to do that one more time, you could honestly create slope arrows going in from all four corners and create something like this. So there's a lot of really interesting forms that are possible once you start building an intuition for how the slope arrow tool works. And that's really what it takes. It takes a little bit of practice to build up that intuition. Now, I want to leave you with these two objects over here. This is a floor element. This is a topo solid. I'm going to select the floor element, edit its boundary, and notice that it also supports slope arrows. Now, actually, it supports slope defining edges as well, but it also supports slope arrows. So I'm going to put a slope arrow in here, draw it out at some angle, click finish. Go ahead and select this, maybe set the height to 3 feet or 900 millimeters, and I'll click finish here. And now you can see that I'm sloping that floor slab. However, one thing that's important to understand about floors with respect to slope arrows is you can only have one. So notice that it's now grayed out. We couldn't add a second one like I did over here. So that's the only limitation when it comes to floors. And I put this one here for you to experiment with on your own. Topo solids also support slope arrows. So feel free to experiment further in this file, trying to build up that intuition on how these slope arrows work. In this video, we're going to add ceiling elements to our model. So to get started, I'm going to go to the Architecture tab and locate the ceiling button right here. So I'm going to click that, and the first thing we want to check is what kind of ceiling you are creating. So if you're working in the Imperial file, choose the 2x4 acoustical ceiling tile system. If you're working in the metric file, that's going to be 600 by 1200 millimeters. Now, there's two ways to create a ceiling. There's automatic ceiling and sketch ceiling. Now, automatic is already chosen, so why don't we start with that for this first example. Now, if I move my mouse into the floor plan, the way the automatic ceiling works is you need to put your mouse inside an enclosed space, and then it will sense the boundaries of that enclosed space. So let's try that right here. Trouble is, you can see that it's sensing the boundary of the entire floor plan. Okay, so the other thing that you want to consider when using the automatic ceiling is the height at which you are about to place the ceiling element. The template file that we used to start this project established the default height of the ceiling, and it was at 9 feet in the Imperial file and 2,700 millimeters in the metric file. That's a little bit too tall for this building. So we need to drop our ceiling down to 8 feet or 2,400 millimeters. So what I want to do is come over here and use the height offset from level on the properties palette. I'm going to put in 8 feet. If you're working in metric, do 2,400 millimeters. And now notice the difference. Now it will properly sense the individual enclosed spaces. Okay. So now that we've done that, I'm going to go ahead and click in this upper left-hand corner here, and that generates a warning. And it says none of the created elements are visible in the floor plan. Now, I wanted to do it this way because it's a common mistake. Okay, so what happened was we are working in a floor plan view here. I'm going to click the modify tool to cancel out, and then just click anywhere to dismiss that warning. We're working in a floor plan which is cut at about waist height and looking down. The ceiling we just created is at 8 feet. We just set that number, and that's up above our head. So it's well outside of the view range of this floor plan. So where we should have been before starting was in a reflected ceiling plan instead. So I kind of wanted to go through that exercise because, again, it's a very common mistake, and it can be frustrating because you're sitting there scratching your head wondering why the ceilings aren't appearing, and it's as simple as not being in the correct view. So here are the ceiling plans on the project browser. I'm going to double click the L1 architectural ceiling plan, and there's our ceiling right there. So it did in fact create the object. It just wasn't visible in the view that we started in. Okay, so now that we've gotten past that issue, let's go back to the ceiling tool and continue. So I'm going to create ceilings like this one in each of the offices. So here, 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 and here, and then these two over on the right-hand side of the plan. So now we had some other ceiling types here on the type selector. So I'm going to switch to a 2x2 acoustical ceiling tile for the next example right there. And that would be 600 by 600 if you're working in the metric file. And I'm going to place one of those here in this break room. Now, when I move over here to the toilet room, I get a similar problem that we've already seen, because now instead of just highlighting one toilet room, it is doing both of them. So the issue here is similar to what we encountered before, but not exactly the same. So notice that the height offset from level is still 8 feet or 2,400 millimeters. So that's not the issue this time. The issue this time is this wall that separates the two restrooms. So I'm going to click the modify tool to cancel out of here. And I'm going to select this wall, and notice that its height is only 8 feet. So that means that that wall just goes up to the height where we're trying to place the ceiling, and that allows the ceiling to pass right above it. Now, in the case where you want an underpin ceiling, that may be exactly what you want. But in this case, that's probably not what we want at the restrooms. So I'm going to raise the height of the wall. You could do that by typing in a new number here, or better is you can connect it to level 2. So I'm going to take the top constraint here and go up to L2, and then I will return to the ceiling command. And now we're able to create separate ceilings on either side of that wall. Now, the next thing I want to show you is another common problem that sometimes occurs. I'm going to switch to this ceiling type called GWB on metal stud. Okay, so there's one of these in each of the the imperial and in the metric file. So this is a drywall ceiling. And then I'm going to come down here to this conference room and click. Now, I clicked, but it doesn't look like anything happened. So sometimes folks are a little dismayed by that, so they click again. And now everything turns orange and I get this, there are identical instances in the same place message. So what's the problem? Well, the first time I clicked, it created the ceiling. We just couldn't see it because unlike the 2x2 or the 2x4 ceilings, it didn't have a grid pattern associated with it. So what I'm going to do is click the modify tool to cancel. I'm going to select this section cut right here, which cuts through all the offices, right click it and choose go to view and zoom in on that location. Right here, I currently have 2 ceiling elements, and I can show you that by doing a crossing selection right here, and notice that it says ceilings 2. So when I clicked the second time, the reason it generated the warning was for that reason. So I'm going to select one of these and delete it. Okay, so just be aware of that. I'm trying to show you all of the little gotchas that usually come into play when folks are placing ceilings here. So I'm going to go ahead and close this section view. Now, the last ceiling that I want to create in this floor plan is here underneath this balcony. So we've got this balcony on level 2, and I'd like to put a ceiling underneath that. Trouble is, if I go to the ceiling tool, it's going to highlight that entire space. Now, this time it has nothing to do with the height of the walls or the height of the ceiling or anything like that. The fact is, there just simply aren't any boundary lines in this location to bound the ceiling. So if you don't have any walls there, then you're going to need to do something else. And that's where sketch ceiling comes into play. So we're just simply going to switch to sketch ceiling, and then you can use any of the normal sketch tools to create the shape of this ceiling. So I'm going to start with pick walls because we do have walls here and here and here. Now this wall flipped to the wrong side, so I'm going to want to address that. So let's click the modify tool, select that one and click flip just to flip it to the inside. Now this edge here is not walls, so I can't use pick walls for that. But there is another option here called pick lines, and this allows me to touch the edges of that floor, and you might want to zoom in to be able to get these edges. And then right here, you're going to need the face of this column. Now, while I'm zoomed in at that location, I'm going to do trim and extend and clean that up, trim and extend and clean that up. So just make sure you're picking the correct sides. Then I'll trim here and here, here and here. And you need to do this all the way around. And then just double check any of the other intersections. That all looks pretty good. Okay. So now I'm going to switch this to the 2x2 or the 600 by 600 just so we can see the hatch pattern when it's done. And I'll click finish. And now you can see we've created a ceiling in that location. So whether you're using the pick ceiling, the auto create ceiling, or the sketch ceiling, you should be able to create all of the ceiling elements that are required. In this video, we're going to manipulate some of our ceilings, and specifically, we're going to adjust the patterns that are applied to them. So let me zoom in over here on the right-hand side of the plan and show you a couple quick examples. So if you move your mouse around inside the space, notice that you're able to actually highlight the individual ceiling grid lines. So you can click and select any one of these lines that you like. Now, notice that the grid pattern in this particular office is running vertically. Maybe I want it to run horizontally instead. So it's as simple as taking one of these grid lines, selecting it, and then going over here to the rotate tool or type RO. Now, when you do that, it usually places the center of rotation at some strange location, so it's always a little off center there. You can click this little dot and then pick it up and move it somewhere else. So I'm going to place it right at the midpoint there. And the result of doing that is going to keep everything centered. So if you let it rotate around that off-center dot, then it won't be centered anymore. Now, you could rotate right on screen using your mouse, but you can also click right up here on the options bar and type in an angle. And I'm just going to type in 90 degrees and press enter. And notice that that has the effect of rotating the entire grid pattern 90 degrees. So what's important to understand about shifting grid patterns is you simply select any line that's convenient and whatever change you make to that line will affect the entire pattern. So that's true of not just rotating, that's also true of moving. So I'm going to move to the room next door and select one of its patterns. And I'm going to start off just by nudging. Nudging is using the arrows on your keyboard. So you can use the left, right, up, down. So if I do a few arrows to the right or to the left or even up and down, you could see I can shift that pattern around in any direction. If you hold the shift key down and then arrow, it does a bigger nudge. It's 10 times the original. So those are all random though, because nudging is just sort of by eye. So if you want something a little bit more precise, you can use the move tool. So here I could select a certain start point and then I could snap to another specific location. Or I could pick a certain start point, start moving in the direction I want to go, and type in a value. So there's a couple different ways you can use these tools to help you position the ceiling. Finally, you can also use the align tool. So here, if I wanted to start the grid at this wall, I could start with the wall as my alignment edge and then pick the grid, and it would shift everything over accordingly. So those are a few techniques that you can use to manipulate the grids. But really, the next question ought to be, how do I know if I need to do that in the first place? Well, let's shift our attention over to these offices on the other side of the plan, and let's talk about that. I think the best way to decide whether or not you need to shift the grids at all in the first place is to add some ceiling fixtures. So you're probably going to have lights or mechanical outlets or other kinds of items up in the ceiling. So place those items first and see where they land. And then if you need to shift things, then you can shift both the ceiling grid and the ceiling mounted fixtures together. So let's go to the architecture tab, and we already know how to place ceiling mounted equipment because it's the same component tool that we've used in previous videos. So the keyboard shortcut is CM. And if you open up the properties palette, the type selector, you can scroll through the list looking for light fixtures, but remember that there's a search at the top, and it might be easier to just search for a keyword. So I'm going to search for the keyword light, and you can see that in this file, I have some light fixtures already installed here. So I'm going to scroll down to the bottommost one, this Troffer light 2x4 parabolic. It's 600 by 1200 in the metric file. And then I'm just going to choose one of its types. And it doesn't really matter which one you choose. I'll choose this 4-lamp one here. Now, this is what we call a face-based family. So it's saying select a host face to place this instance. Now, face-based families default to place on vertical face. So you want to pay attention to that because for light fixtures, you're probably going to want to switch it to place on face. And that means we're placing it on the horizontal face that we can see, okay? Now, it will try to snap to the grid, and you can usually get good results with that. But a lot of times I'll just place it randomly because I find it easier to place one, come in, go to the align tool and align it in both directions. And then once I've done that, I can select it, go to copy, and I can copy it to different locations. And so now I have a group of 4 lights. I'm going to select all 4 of those, zoom out, and then I can copy those into the other offices. And of course, when I do this, you can see that everything is off center. And in fact, the lights on the right are actually poking out of the rooms. So clearly we need to adjust those ceiling grids. So let's zoom back in now at the one up at the top. And something you need to be aware of with face-based families is if you move the grid, and I'll just do that with shift nudge, the light fixtures won't go along with it. They'll kind of stay behind. So let me undo that. And the solution is quite simple. Just select both the grid and the light fixtures. So I'm going to select all 4 lights and one of the grid lines. And now I'm going to go to the move tool, pick any start point, start moving in the direction I want to go. And it looks to me like if I move half a tile, I should be in pretty good shape. So I'm working in imperial, so that's going to be 2 feet. If you're working in metric, it's going to be 600 millimeters, and I'll press enter, and that looks pretty good. Those lights are centered in that direction. Let's keep it all selected and do the same thing in the opposite direction, but this time it's just 1 foot imperial or 300 millimeters in metric. And now I've managed to keep everything centered, but it now matches the space a lot better. So you can repeat that in each of these other offices, and when you're done, it should look something like this. Revit has a number of opening elements. They all share one basic characteristic in common. Opening elements are a void element that cuts away from solids. So it's similar to the way doors and windows behave. When you place a door or a window in a wall, it cuts a hole in that wall. So with the opening elements, you're just creating the hole that you want to cut through the object, but you're not filling it with any geometry in that process. So I'm going to demonstrate 2 of the opening elements in this video, and the other 3 that are available will behave in a similar way, and you can explore those on your own. You're going to find all of the opening elements on the architecture ribbon right here. So the first one I'm going to demonstrate is the dormer opening, and I've actually created 2 conditions here in this file. One is complete already, and the other one we're going to do together. So if I take these walls here and select them, and this roof right here, and go to the sunglasses pop up and do hide element, you're going to see that dormer opening penetrating through the roof below. That's what we're going to create over here on the opposite side. So let me reset the temporary hide, and let's kind of focus in on this dormer right here. To get started, we need to finish the geometry of the dormer itself that I started building here. So you can see I've got 3 walls that are actually penetrating through the roof right now. But over here, notice that the wall has this triangle shape. So what I did was I actually used the attach top and base tool that we've talked about in an earlier video, but I used the base functionality of that. So let me demonstrate. I'm going to select this wall, hold down the control key, pick this one and this one right here. So all 3 of those walls that make up the dormer geometry, and attach top and base. This is the same command we use to attach walls to the underside of the roof. The difference is when we were doing that, we used the top option. But notice that right next to that is a base option. So if you switch this to base and then pick the roof, and remember to pick the edge of the roof, it will cut the bottom edges of the walls to match the roof instead of the top edges. Okay, so that's the first thing. The next thing that we want to do is take this little roof that I have here and extend it back to connect with the other roof. And we've got a specialized tool specifically for that purpose right here called Join and Unjoin Roof. So we're going to click that. And the first prompt is going to ask us to select a roof edge. Okay, so that means an edge back here of the roof that we want to attach. And then once we've done that, it will prompt you to select a surface. So we're going to pick the edge of the surface of the main roof, and it will extend it back to connect that geometry to the other roof. So now that we've built our little dormer, we can now create the opening. So we're going to go back to architecture, and we're going to click the dormer opening tool. It will prompt us to select the roof that we're going to cut with this opening. So that's again going to be this main roof. And then it defaults to pick roof or wall edges. So we want to pick the little small roof, and that creates this small triangle sketch here. We're going to pick each of these walls along the 3 sides of the dormer. Now, it'll be a little easier to visualize this next step if we go to the roof plan temporarily, and let's zoom in. And what I want to make sure here is that my dormer opening is on the inside of the walls. So it looks to me as though they are, but one easy way to tell is to just click these little flip grips. And actually they weren't. It was on the outside. So I'm glad I tried that, right? So you can see here that you can click these little flip grips and flip them to the inside. Okay. Then we're going to go to trim and extend and clean all this up. And then when you're done, you click finish. And I've created a little section cut here for us to see the result. And you can see that one of the unique features of a dormer opening is that the opening is flat at the top and it's vertical down near the bottom. So the opening automatically creates the correct shape based on the dormer geometry. So that is our first opening tool that I wanted to share with you here. The other one is also very useful, but very simple. And I'm going to show you that on the first floor plan and this section right here. So here's an elevator going up the 3 floors of this building. If I open up this section cut, you can see that unfortunately our elevator is being interrupted by these floor slabs along the way. Now, one solution would be to select the floor slab, edit the boundary, edit the sketch, and create a little hole for the elevator. But the trouble is I'd need to do that 3 times for each of the floor slabs that are in the way. Alternatively, we can create a shaft opening. So a shaft opening is just an object that's an opening object that you can create multiple stories tall, and it will cut through everything in its path: floors, ceilings, roofs, etc. So let's go back to the first floor plan here and create the shaft opening. So we're going to click the button, and then that puts us in sketch mode. And for this example, I'm just going to draw a simple rectangle, and I'm going to start on the outside of these walls here on the left and go to the inside face of the wall on the right. And that's the shape that I want for my shaft right there. I will click finish. It's still selected. So the way that void elements work is when they're selected, you can see them, but when you click away from them, they deselect and it's as if they're not there. Okay, so they automatically take care of their own visibility. Now, notice here in section that it is cutting through this floor slab here. Well, if you move your mouse kind of nearby where that shaft is and click, all we need to do here is adjust the height. So it's actually cutting through the bottommost slab and the second floor slab. It's not getting through the third floor slab. So you could just drag this little grip up a little bit, or another way to do that would be to set the top constraint, and I like to set that to a level like maybe the roof, and now you can see the shaft is cutting through all floors and allowing the elevator to pass through.